Just a brief outline. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who am I and the artwork that I've been making over the last several years about bees and other pollinators, and then about the range of futures that I can envision and that I'm exploring in this art show. There we go. Sorry. This is me. This is me in my studio. Sometimes I joke I became a visual artist by getting a doctorate in physics, which is not necessarily the traditional route, but I'm actually a marine geophysicist by training, which means that I developed new technology to image below the seafloor and use the tools of physics to tell us about the ocean floor. But I had two great loves in growing up, the math and science on the one hand, and the art and history on the other. And I was doing these two things in parallel. So I was, a geophysicist by day and an artist by night. Um, and then now it's sort of in series where I was mainly working as a scientist, and now I'm mainly working as an artist. Um, and the main medium that I use in my art is relief printmaking. So it's often lino cut, sometimes it's wood cut. And if you're not familiar with the method, it is like a stamp. I carve into a substrate. Usually it could be lino, just like literal flooring, but it's more often a artist material that's a little softer, easier to carve. So a synthetic lino or a vinyl product. And I carve what I want to print in reverse and I ink it up and then I burnish it onto paper or fabric or whatever I'm using. And I usually do this with, elbow grease with my own hands and physical labor. There is a glass baren, which is a Japanese tool for burnishing, but you can even use a spoon, or to stew, and I do have some presses, which I sometimes work with as well. I use other methods sometimes in my work. Sometimes there's some drawing and painting and sculpture and even electronics. But printmaking is the center of what I do. And printmakers talk about mark making. You make an image and on a substrate of some sort, and you reproduce that image. And you can reproduce the image many times. That's one of the great benefits of printmaking. You just ink it up and you burnish more paper onto it. So this is me as in the field as a marine geophysicist. Um, so what I found with these two sort of sides of my interests and my employment is that the science started making its way into the art and becoming the focus of my art. And one of the things that I've wanted to do is to express science in a more universal language. So because my background is specifically is physics, one of the jobs I had was teaching physics to art students. And I met so many people who were fascinated and really wanted an in and to learn more, but they were not comfortable in the language of mathematics. And so I found teaching I was often like drawing pictures on the blackboard. And I really find that the visual language is more immediate and can communicate with more people. So my artwork is often telling stories from the history of science or about natural history in order to translate the science to a larger audience. Right. And so I've actually been making artwork about bees now for like a dozen years. And the birders talk about their spark bird. So it's the bird that captured their imagination, and then they found themselves just being obsessed and watching birds wherever they were. And for me, I kind of have a spark insect, and that would be the bumblebee. And so it was the first bee that I portrayed in my artwork. And when I made my print, I didn't even know there were multiple bumblebees. I thought a bumblebee was a bumblebee. But of course, there are hundreds of bumblebees, and there are in fact thousands and thousands of bee species worldwide. Even just here in Toronto, we have more than 360 different species of bees. And they are the workhorse of pollination, if you will. They're the most important pollinators are bees. There are other insects, some mammals and birds also contribute, but bees are the real star of the show. And the bees that most people, if you ask someone who's not a entomologist and they're not an ecologist, you ask them about a bee, they'll tell you about honeybees. Everybody's heard of honeybees, and they think of, these are cooperative insects that live together in a hive. They have these iconic hexagonal cells. Um, and in fact, honeybees are quite unusual in that the vast majority of bees are solitary bees. They don't live together in hives. They don't, most of them don't produce honey, in fact. Um, and the honeybee is a European species. So here in North America, it's strictly an agricultural species that has been imported here for honey and for pollination services. Um, and it turns out that that has not been successful for the wild bees of North America. Um, Honeybees can outcompete native species, and further, they spread bee diseases into the wild populations. So the way we use them in agriculture, we take honeybees and they get moved from farm to farm. And so if they have a bee disease, they're spreading it. We've created a super spreading event through our agricultural methods. Um, so I started making art that was really trying to draw attention to these are the bees that actually live in our backyard, that actually are native here and are important to our ecosystems. So the first one I'm showing on the left is just the bees, and I made that in 2013. And it's got 6 prints, linocut prints of different bees. The one on the top is a European honeybee, but all the others are native to this place. There's a leafcutter, a sweat bee, a longhorn bee, a mason bee, and a bumblebee. And what I did was I printed them in electrically conductive ink. So each of those bees are attached to some electronics sort of hidden behind the plane of the print. And they could act as a capacitative sensor. So that means if you approach this print, if your hand approaches any one of those bees, I could sense that you'd done that. And I connected it to a microprocessor that would trigger a sound file. And the sound file would play on the print itself. Because if you look carefully, you can see there's a spiral print back of the sheet, and that is also an electrically conductive ink. So all a speaker is a spiral of current, a membrane, and a magnet. So there's a magnet behind there, and I'd literally play a sound file. So each bee would identify itself if you put your hand near it and tell you a bit about itself. And then a couple years later, I made the one on the right, which is a very similar kind of piece, but I'm really trying to focus on the differences in how they live in their homes. So that's called bee homes. And I have the hexagons up at the upper right corner near the honeybee to say, this is what every school kid learned about bees, that these bees that live in hives with the hexagonal cells. But all the other bees have these circular holes as entrances to their nests. Most of them are ground nesters or they live in stems. So each of those bees, if you approach them with your hand, they would tell you a bit about the species and its nesting habit. Um, and then I've continued to make further work about bees. One of the great projects I was involved in was called the Bees of Toronto. And there's a series of publications put out by the City of Toronto called the Biodiversity Series on a series of different themes. And they made this little book called The Bees of Toronto. And it's really neat. It's a cultural history of bees in the city. So they brought together visual artists and writers and people in arts and culture with scientists to share the work that they make related to bees. So it had a little bio of artists, myself included, and some of our work. And then it's also a field guide. So it has images and information about the 360 bee species we find here. Um, and it's free. You can get it in Toronto libraries. If they still have copies, they'll give it to you. But it's also online. You can find the full PDF online, um, and see all the artwork. The large piece in the middle here is about leafcutter bees. And these are two different species are portrayed of leafcutter bees. You can see how different they look if you look carefully. And the interesting thing about this piece is it's not only about and portraying the leafcutter bees, but it's a sort of collaboration with them. Leafcutter bees make these little telltale half moon bites out of leaves and petals. And they use them to create what someone cleverly called a bee burrito, like literally like a little burrito or like a sleeping bag, if you will, for their young, for their eggs wrapped up in the plant material. And so printmakers, I mentioned earlier, they do mark making on a substrate and then they ink it and print it. So the bees themselves were doing the mark making. They were choosing the leaves, they were choosing the petals. These are all from my garden. And they made those shapes and I inked them up and I printed them into the print. And so the other images on the slide, there's I now can't see because it's behind my own image here, but there's a bumblebee. The one in the middle is this lovely little bee I've recently learned about, and I'm totally obsessed with its nesting habits. It's the eastern snail shell nesting mason bee, and these little blue bees find discarded snail shells, and they make their nests inside of them. And I just think this is the cutest thing I've ever heard. Um, and then in the bottom right is a rusty patched bumblebee. And the rusty patched bumblebee is the first bee in both Canada or the US to be put on our respective um, endangered species lists. So the idea of a bee species being on an endangered species is frankly pretty horrifying. This was one of the most common bumblebees even when I was a little girl. And now scientists believe they're extirpated in Canada. So they have died. We don't have them here anymore. And it's from the sort of factors that are affecting a lot of species in conservation issues. It's things like climate change and habitat loss, but it's also pesticide use and, as I mentioned earlier, complications of the way we use managed agricultural species and the diseases that get out into the wild populations. Um, on the left here is a piece that is called The Redbud and the Bees. And I made this for Creature Conserve, that is another organization that brings artists together with scientists to work on issues of conservation and nature. And they had this show about urban wildlife and human conflict and issues in the face of climate change. And so I proposed to them, I wanted to make art about some bees because most people, when they think about urban wildlife, they're going to think about the charismatic mammals, things like, raccoons or Norway rats or foxes or whatever are getting into cities and having occasional conflict with people. The idea of the show, each artist had to pair up with an entomologist, or in appropriate scientists for their species. So I worked with a local entomologist who had this great program for the public. Sometimes this is called citizen science, and sometimes the word citizen is a bit politicized. So something like participatory science, where non-scientists can contribute, and it's called the Redbud Project. And so in Toronto, people who had redbud trees were helping to make observation of what bees were using the tree, using the pollen or the leaf matter or what have you. But when she said the thing about wildlife conflicts when it comes to um, bees is the carpenter bees. And it turns out that redbud trees are more and more common in Toronto because the climate is warming. So it's easier for them to live here. Um, they previously were sort of a range didn't extend this far north, but they're also wildly popular with gardeners. So people keep planting them. So we get more and more of them. And these flowering trees are really popular with our native pollinators, so that's great. But they're also really popular with the eastern carpenter bee, whose range is also extending north because of climate change. So what happens is people are planting these, they're feeding the little blue mason bee there, for instance, or the leafcutter bee at the top uses the leaf matter. They both eat the pollen, but they're also attracting the larger bee there in the middle, which is the carpenter bee, and they will make their nests in wood, hence their name. So they actually drill little holes in wood in people's properties, whether it's their outdoor furniture or their houses themselves or their fences. And this is, not usually popular with the homeowners. So I've, on the bottom there, I have an actual piece of old wood where I've drilled holes the exact size of actual carpenter bee holes, and I've printed it directly. So theirs is a sort of a mixed interaction. And then the next print on the right there, again, I've got the mason bee and a bumblebee, and it's a cherry tree in blossom. And an interesting thing here is that in this part of North America, cherry trees and people who farm cherry trees find that the honeybees aren't that good at pollinating them. Naturally, in the environment, plants and insects co-evolve, and they have these wonderful symbiotic relationships where the plants and their parts typically are matched up with pollinators that fit very well. You know, the sizes and shapes work together, and the ways in which the insects move are well suited to pollinating them. Well, the honeybees just don't do a very efficient job with the cherry trees, but some of the native wild bees do. So farmers that were including wild spaces and wild plants and wildflowers to encourage native bees, including things like the blue orchard mason bee and bumblebees like this Bombus impatiens, were finding that it was much more effective. The mason bee is an interesting case because it's both a wild native bee to this region and is sometimes used in managed species. So farmers sometimes work with them directly as well. And then the next large project I wanted to tell you about was something that I was involved in a couple years ago. We formed um, a collaboration which we named our favorite bees. And we put on a show called These Are a Few of Our Favorite Bees. And it was me and Sarah Peebles, who's actually a composer, a musician by training, but she makes these bee boxes, and a lot of her work is about bees. And she records the sound that the bees make in observation boxes where there are spaces where bees can nest and be observed, and there are headphones so you can listen to them. Rob Cruikshank, who's an artist and engineer, and Stephen Humphrey, rather, who's a poet, who's also made poems about bees. And so we collaborated together. And the idea was that we would make houses for bees in something called a lambe theater. It's a tradition in South America. These little box theaters, maybe the size of your microwave oven or something, with an observation hole so you can look inside. And inside, there's a whole scene and basically a puppet show. So one person audience can observe these scenes at a time. So we thought we would make little boxes with homes for various native species and try to convey that these are our neighbors. And like us, they live in, little homes, sometimes apartments and condos in Toronto or small houses, and get people to empathize and understand these bees as our neighbors. So this is what I created. In that box, you can see there's an observation window on the front that you can peer in and see, and there's a skylight on the top. And inside the box, I've created kind of like an apartment for a bee, and there's a sculpture of my bee was the rusty patch bumblebee, which I mentioned previously, which is the now endangered bumblebee. And so on the wall, I made wallpaper, which was printed with leaves that would be part of its environment, leaves and petals and so forth. And the back window, each of us had a video screen where we were playing field footage of the bees in their native environments or their nests, if possible. So there's a honeybee nest on the video. And so I've made it so it's like the bee can look out the window. And I created little furnishings for the bee. And everything that I made was related specifically to the rusty patch bumblebee and the plants it used in the environment. So on the top, I've got a little chair made of ivy inside and willow. These are plants. The salix, the willows, are very popular with the bees and particularly the bumblebees. And the paper flowers or the plants inside, these are all plants that are important to this bee. And the little table is actually a basket of made from dandelions um, which aren't native, and they aren't really great nutrition for bees, actually, in this part of the world. But they do like them. And the little book on top contains a poem by Stephen about the rusty patch bumblebee. Adjacent to this box, I've got another little box with basically their specimens. So these are plants. There's an apple. There's pussy willow. These are plants that would have been pollinated by this bee. And there's an actual specimen of a rusty patch bumblebee and magnifying glass so you can look at it. So it's no mean feat, actually, to get a specimen of a rusty patch bumblebee in Canada now because they are endangered. But so I was very grateful I had some entomologists who were able to help me with that and supply that for us. Um, and what I've got there is a vessel. It's like a jar mug with illustrations of some fruit that are also pollinated by this bee. And it has a transducer on it. So the sounds associated with the video, recorded sounds of the actual species, are played through the mug. So it's amplifying the sound. So that is what's producing the sound is actually something associated with the plants it pollinates. So there's another look. You can really see into the little apartment I made. And there's a vessel at the back. It's made out of beeswax because bumblebees do produce some wax. And you can see the video screen behind. A little more details of some of the things I produced for this exhibit. Um, the the rug that I produced, it's all I dyed it with plant dyes, and each of the plant dyes were produced from plants pollinated by this bug. And the second thing that was included in this show was a piece called In the Landscape, which was a collaboration with Sarah. And so here you can see a projection of one of her bee boxes, which has the holes drilled in it so the bees could make their nests in them. And there were bees that were identified that had made this nests in there, including leafcutter bees and um, resin bees. So it's actually a video that's projected. You can watch it change in time. And then in the background, I've made prints of various plants these bees might have visited. There are, again, the leaves that have been used by leafcutter bees and have little bite marks taken out of them. And so these are plants they would have used either for pollen or for plant material. And there's some cedar because the resin bee actually makes a resin with that. And connected from this large print, oh, the little trails are supposed to be like the trails of the bee. And I've painted those in pigments that entomologists use to track insects when they do their research. Um, but off to the side, there's a large stick with wires that are the speaker wire. And each of them are colored in stripes. And the stripes are actually the DNA barcodes of the species that have been found in the bee box. And so a DNA barcode is just taking the DNA code of the base pairs and translating them not just into letters but into colors. But so even the idea is even if you're not a scientist and you don't look at that and get all the information that is encoded in the DNA, anyone looking at those wires will see that the colors are very similar and that these bees share a lot of genetic material, but then there are differences in the stripes, which indicates that they're different species. So that brings me to this project and looking at the future of pollination. So the first thing that I thought of was that this is a huge question. Um, Pollination is a huge issue globally because we're experiencing what entomologists call the insect apocalypse. We are losing entire insect species, but also individuals of various species at an alarming rate. Um, and we need them for our environments, our habitats to survive, and our food sources. Um, but while the issues are global, they're all local in that the specific problems in any given environment and the specific solutions in any given environment are dependent on the species that actually live there. And so they do depend greatly on geography. Um, For instance, some of you might have heard about No Mo May, which was really, really popular and a great sort of science communication project in the UK, where it really stressed, don't pull up all your dandelions, that bees use them uh, for early food sources. The trouble was that dandelions and the honeybees are both native to Europe, and neither are native here in North America. And it turns out that dandelions aren't actually great nutrition for the bees that are native here. So sometimes solutions from one place don't travel to other places without adapting them. So I thought, well, I have to choose a place. So I chose this place. So all of the species that I portray are native to Southern Ontario. A lot of them have ranges that would be most of Eastern North America, but all of them live where I live. And then I thought, well, I don't know what's going to happen. So I want to look at a range of what's going to happen from perhaps a utopian view of the future to a dystopian view of the future. And I want to ask some questions. Can we foster a resurgence of native pollinators by reintroducing native plants in all these spaces, urban, farm, rural, and neglected spaces? Can we make better at decisions about agriculture than using managed species like honeybees, which can outcompete native species and spread bee diseases? What does our environment stand to lose if we let pollinator populations collapse? And then because we're looking at nature-inspired technological solutions, if pollinators must be replaced by technology, which species will get pollinated and which will not? My concern on thinking about this is that if it's up to us, are we only going to take care of things that are lucrative to us? And then pollinators aren't just their job in that they don't just pollinate plants. In a lot of cases, they're the base of food chains. And so if we lose the pollinators, what other species will lose their food sources? Um, and will the food that we eat lose will we lose this food as well? So I really want to provoke the viewers to consider the consequences of what we're facing here, but also to consider the tools that we can use to push ourselves towards the utopian end here and a healthier environment for the future. So I envisioned the gallery and wanted to present like a spectrum of potential outcomes. And my idea was to have sort of the more utopian on one end and approaching a corner, and then the dystopian extended the other. So in the middle was sort of a pragmatic middle where perhaps we have to use some technology to deal with pollinator loss. Um, and the far end would be, what if we don't do this thoughtfully, if we only rely on technology and we don't foster a healthier future for pollinators? And I thought a viewer can view these pieces going either direction. I'm going to present them from the utopian to dystopian, but I hope that's just to get my message across. So I started with a map, and maybe this is because I am an earth scientist by training, but that's how I thought of it. And so I looked at a lot of aerial photographs and maps and drone footage of Toronto. And so this is just a neighborhood viewed from above, and it's a lino cut print, and I've collaged other prints onto it. And one of the really refreshing things, actually, if you do send a drone up in Toronto and look down on the city, is that it's green from above. Um, Despite 4 million people and all the buildings and roads and infrastructure, we have an incredible tree canopy over the city. So I took a fairly dense residential area, and I thought, well, what if I greatly increase the tree canopy? Because trees are often overlooked. We think of what are the early food sources for bees, and do we need dandelions or other wildflowers right away? And often the earliest sources of food are tree pollen. So they make those of us with allergies a bit miserable, but they're a great food source for the bees. And they also, of course, affect the temperature. So planting more trees would help moderate temperature in the wake of climate change within our cities. And so that's a great thing to do. And the other thing I've done, if you can see the color in the green, is I put gardens everywhere, pollinator gardens everywhere in people's yards, on their roofs. And so if people used all their roof space for pollinator gardens, and also I've put solar panels for better energy choices for the future. And then I've imagined like a reduction in needs for transportation and vehicles on the road. So I've got very light vehicle use and a couple of bicycles with trailers um, in this future. And then the next piece here is the largest piece in the show. It's a pollinator garden. And everything is more or less life size in this piece. The whole piece is 30 inches by 22 inches. Some of the insects I've exaggerated a little because it's very hard to carve something as small as an insect. But everything in this piece represents native species that would thrive in this area and really attract pollinators to your gardens, wherever they are. So I've got the common milkweed, which is an important story because of the monarch butterfly, which is sitting on it. And as you probably know, the monarch butterfly populations have totally collapsed. And one of the main reasons there is that we spent years getting rid of their only food source. So their only home for their early food source for their caterpillars. They make their cocoons on the common milkweed and various milkweeds, depending on where exactly they live. And the definition of weed is pretty arbitrary. This is a beautiful flower. The scent is heavenly. Um, and but we decided, well, we didn't put it there. We didn't choose it to go there. And when it produces seeds, it's a bit messy. And so people pulled them up. But luckily, there's been a real move to replace them in gardens. And they are wildly popular with the pollinators. I have several in my garden. And anytime I go out there, I see multiple species on any given plant. So the butterflies, there's milkweed beetle and bug, which are both included in this print, but also lots of bees. They love these plants. We've got wild geraniums here. There's Canada goldenrod. Um, Another plant, people tend to think of these wildflowers as weeds, but they're gorgeous plants and they are popular food sources for our pollinators. So there's also a swallowtail butterfly. I've got some Canada columbine here, and some black-eyed Susan, um, various butterflies and moths and bumblebee and sweat bee and a resin bee all in this print. And there's a log at the bottom, which is important to have a log or some wood, old wood in your pollinator garden makes a home, a potential home for the insects that live there. So you can even see they've got some holes marked on this log. The next piece is kind of like my thesis for the show. Being a printmaker, it's maybe inevitable. Eventually, you start printing broadsides, especially if you have something you want to argue. And so this is my argument. Our fate is tied to that of the insects. Um, we can ignore them at our own peril. We need these animals for to keep our habitats functioning and for our food sources. So every one of these animals portrayed in this print are native species and pollinators here. So I have the bees, which I've shown previously, multiple butterflies and moths, and one beetle, it's a firefly there, and they're amongst some of the many, many pollinators we have here. Next, these are three separate prints I've grouped together, just showing in a more utopian future and what we have now, some of the important pollinators in their environment. I've got the monarch, the milkweed beetle, the bumblebee on the common milkweed. Um, I've got the monarch on the echinacea and the black-eyed Susan. These are also wonderful native wildflowers that attract a lot of pollinators. And the one in the middle is a mason bee on blueberry. So the blueberry, of course, is also native. There are many different species of blueberry as well. Um, but it's both the flowers, right, but also the food. So the blueberries, both wild and as we use in agriculture, they need things like the mason bees to pollinate them. And so I've returned to my thesis here to really try and drive home that these pollinators are required for our very own food sources. Um, so in this print, I've portrayed a lot of the specific food crops that are cultivated here in Ontario that depend on insect pollination. So I haven't done all of the crops that we grow here, I skipped all the crops that are strictly produced for oil or to feed livestock. And in some cases, a lot of these fruits and vegetables represent categories rather than just a specific species. For instance, there's all sorts of squash. And after a while, I thought, from the outside, beans look pretty similar. So there are way more bean species than I've portrayed, but all of these melons and pumpkin and squash and cherries and all the berries, tomatoes and peppers, apples and peaches and plums and apricots and all this. Um, all of these plants need insects to pollinate them. So if you're viewing the exhibit, you're now advancing towards the middle, which is sort of the pragmatic middle in my mind. And so scientists have already been thinking about what are we going to do without the pollinators? So we've lost a lot of them already. And they are in peril with the state of their populations. So there are already scientists that are working on artificial pollination. And a lot of the solutions that are being developed are miniature drones, miniature artificial drones. And this one that I'm showing here is called a robo-bee. So it literally, it's about the size of a large insect, and it can fly around and be solar powered, and in a similar way to an insect, touch down on flowers and go to other plants and pollinate them. And some research says in some cases they're even more efficient than natural pollinators. And so when I heard about this, my first response was horror, to be frank. Because we have in our environment, we have all these plants and insects and other pollinators that co-evolved to fit each other like a hand in a glove. And it's this naturally occurring system that works incredibly well. And we have so disrupted our environment that we now need to step in and start cleaning up our mess. Um, so I wasn't thrilled with the idea of a pollination drone. Um, but on thinking about it, I've got a sort of a pragmatic middle ground, which is that perhaps there are instances where we're using machines would be helpful or less harmful than some of our current practices. Um, On the right is a piece that says robo-bees don't dance nor escape and spread bee diseases. So one of the beauty of the honeybee is the way it communicates through dance. In the hive, they do something called the waggle dance. And literally by the way that they line up with the grid of the honeycomb, and they shake and they turn, they communicate to one another the best sources of pollen that they found. Go to this flower, it's west, and then turn right or what have you. They're actually communicating that through dance. So these artificial tools obviously don't have these beautiful behaviors, but perhaps there are instances where it would be better to use a robot that can't outcompete native bees or spread bee diseases. Perhaps that would be helpful. So I've portrayed a robo bee with the cherries, which you'll remember I said weren't actually all that efficiently pollinated by honeybees. And I've included a native pollinator. This is the clearwing hummingbird moth with the robo bee. So maybe there's a world they can coexist peacefully. I think in most instances at this stage, these artificial drones are used more in greenhouses where they're, you know, enclosed from the environment. But if the trend continues, we might have to think about having artificial pollination outside of controlled spaces and in the environment. So that brings me, as we're now extending into the more dystopian thoughts about what are the consequences here. And so I started to think of myself as a propagandist for the bees. Um, And the first message is these are three prints. I've shown them here on the slide together, and they're grouped together in the exhibit, but they're three separate prints. But we're not weeds. The definition of weed is arbitrary. Um, I've again shown the common milkweed because it is so important to the monarch. But with a robobee, if we're the ones calling the shots, if we're the ones producing the pollinators, using our resources in terms of materials and time and energy and engineering and manufacturing, are we going to take care of the environment out around and the wildflowers, or are we only going to pollinate uh, crops we can use for food and money-making ventures? So the messages I've chosen are we're not weeds. The next one is reproductive rights for all plants, because I really want um, people to empathize with the plant. Um, it has a right to exist and continue to exist. And by destroying pollinators, we're endangering the plants as well. And I don't want to have a future where they're not deemed important. Um, and so the last one says, don't let drones decide. And those are some other versions of existing pollination drones. There's sort of a cousin of the RoboBee, if you will, it looks more like a helicopter, and one that looks like a crane fly, as well as the RoboBee. So it can't be left to humans and our tools to determine what does and doesn't get pollinated. Um, my next thought was about wildlife interactions, and if we have to have pollinators, artificial pollinators in the wild, what will happen when other species meet them? So, as I mentioned, bees and other pollinators aren't just out there pollinating, they're often the base of the food chain. So I've got here the large print is a loggerhead shrike. They're kind of a really charismatic bird. You see these images sometimes um, where they look quite vicious, these tiny little birds, but they will take down their prey. They often prey on insects, but also sometimes things as large as a mouse, mammals and lizards and so on. And then they impale them on spikes. Sometimes, barbed wire on farms or what have you, or just a thorn tree. So here's this proud loggerhead shrike that's taken down a drone. And I imagine, seeing these things that are about the right size and flying about, it might very well hunt and impale a drone, but it can't eat it. Then in the bottom, I've got a dragon hunter dragonfly. And so these are some of the largest dragonflies in this part of the world, and they hunt other dragonflies. They hunt monarch butterflies, so large insects. So I imagine if a dragon hunter would see a pollination drone that looks just like an insect, that looks like a crane fly, it might very well try and hunt that as well, but it can't eat that. And then lastly, I wasn't sure if I could make people empathize with a spider, because I know sadly people often have a kind of instinctive negative response, and they don't see them as deserving or beautiful. But even if you don't feel good about spiders, I hope you would understand something like this yellow garden spider, which makes these really enormous webs, are liable to catch any miniature drone that's as small as an insect. And so, these drones will be faced with the same sort of hazards that insects face, um, and get caught in spider webs. And so then lastly, I've returned to the map. And this is what happens if we don't take these matters into consideration. So it's the same neighborhood in Toronto, but without the tree cover, even less tree cover than we have now, and without the pollinator gardens. All the gardens have just been replaced with turf. You know, you might as well put a carpet on your lawn. It doesn't even let the fresh water get down into the ground, and or they've been pulled up altogether to make parking. And the roads are crowded with transport trucks and large vehicles, and no bicycles. Um, and this would be a much hotter and less pleasant place to live, where you have to think about whether all these plants that we saw elsewhere um, would still exist. So, uh, so that the viewer doesn't have to think about, oh, you know, we've gone to this very sad place, you can turn around and go back the other way and return to the pollinator garden at the front if that's how you experience the exhibit. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. And I want to thank everybody in the manufactured ecosystems. It's been a real pleasure to meet all these varied and fascinating people. Um, and in particular, I want to thank my group. The other people in the pollination group is writer and artist Rosemary Moscow, who's going to be producing um, some fiction about the future of pollination, and entomologist Ellen Richards, who has just been the most fabulous resource. Um, we bring questions to her, and she goes off and reads the research literature and summarizes it for us. And it's just so freeing because I feel like I'm not, you know, pestering specialists in other fields for information. It's just this enthusiasm and thoroughness of what she gives us is wonderful. And also just to bounce ideas off. I really appreciated being able to pose badly posed questions sometimes to Ellen because she knew what I was trying to do. So I didn't feel like I had to have it perfectly worked out. Um, for instance, and I said, you know, I asked her about insectivorous species, and she was the one who suggested the shrike because it is sort of charismatic and might appeal to people. And then I just included some of the resources that I used. If this will be in my talk, if you want to see it later. I made all of this work with a Garden for the Rusty Patched Bumblebee on my desk next to me and was regularly consulting it. It's a wonderful book by master gardener Lorraine Johnson and entomologist Sheila Kola about how to make pollinator gardens. Um, and even if you only have a balcony, you know, and you can put some pot plants out, what you can do, and native species and different types of environments, and it's really, really, really great. Um, and I was reading the Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I really think benefited and enjoyed the ideas that she was discussing about the gift economy and the whole, whether we think of these pollinators strictly for what they can do for us or more of the gifts that they bring and the gifts that we can give them. The Xerxes Society is always the greatest place to go for information about any of this stuff. You can find the Bees of Toronto book that I mentioned. The whole thing's online and it's freely available. Bee City Canada has great resources. There's the Manufactured Ecosystems website on there. You can check out all the fascinating work that everybody is doing. And I try and keep all my bee art in one place. So if you're interested in seeing it, it's there. Um, Resonating Bodies is Sarah Peeble's website about some of her sci art about bees, including the work we've done together, but also all of the other things, and a lot of resources again for learning about the bees in your environment and what would help them and what doesn't, and so forth.